Multimedia Publishing Incorporated, Denver, Colorado, presents the Get Acquainted series, introducing authors and places in American literature. This unit, written by Paul Friesen, covers the years of Samuel Clemens' life beginning in 1868, when he was 33 years old. He was now an accomplished writer and lecturer, a resident of eastern United States and Europe, until his death in 1910, at the age of 74. In this unit, you will learn how Mark Twain met Olivia Langdon, with whom he shared 34 years of happy marriage, and how he established his residence and his reputation in Hartford, Connecticut, among writers, ministers, and businessmen. You will also learn how his sympathetic nature and generosity benefited needy people, how his eventual pessimism developed out of inhumanity and social injustice, and how he maintained a humorous attitude despite what he saw and heard. By 1867, at the age of 32, Samuel Clemens' career as a writer was firmly established, and his pen name, Mark Twain, was well known. He had written for several Western newspapers and had lectured. From San Francisco, he sailed to New York, intending to take a train back to Missouri to visit his family. In New York City, he read of an excursion aboard the Quaker City steamer, leaving shortly for Europe and the Holy Land. It was a novelty he could not resist. It proved to be an exciting, often humorous, sometimes exasperating voyage. The voyage proved also to be the beginning of Mark Twain's love affair with the most beautiful girl he had ever seen. One day, a fellow passenger, Charles Langdon, showed Mark a tiny picture of his sister, Olivia Langdon. Mark exclaimed, "Why, she has the most beautiful face that surely any mortal ever had. Goodness and gentleness, and I could worship a girl like that. I mean it, Charlie. I hope I may die if I don't." Charles invited Mark to meet his sister in New York City, where the Langdons were visiting. After their first meeting, Mark was madly in love. 5 days later, he saw her again. He recorded in his autobiography, "I had 34 calls on my list, and this was the first one. I continued it during 13 hours and put the other 33 off till next year." For the next 2 years, he visited her frequently at the Langdon Mansion in Elmira. Meanwhile, he wrote the account of the Quaker City tour under the title Innocents Abroad. The book was an immediate success, earning for him enough income to support a wife and establish a home. But Mark Twain's finances were not the deciding factor in his request for permission to marry Olivia. Olivia and her parents objected to his rough manners, his coarse language, and his incessant cigar smoking. They demanded reform. Determined to win her, Mark complied with their demands. In a letter to the Langdons, he wrote, "Now I never swear. I never taste wine or spirits upon any occasion whatsoever. I am orderly, and my conduct is above reproach in a worldly sense. And finally, I now claim I am a Christian." Mark Twain and Olivia Langdon were married February 2nd, 1870. She was 24, he was 34. Their first home was in Buffalo, New York, but after several tragic experiences, they moved to a rented house in Hartford, Connecticut. Olivia longed for a permanent home, and Mark was quick to grant her wishes. In 1874, they moved into their beautiful, elaborate Hartford mansion. Large houses were popular in Hartford, but none equaled the grandeur and expansiveness of Mark Twain's home. It was situated in an area known as Nook Farm, a residential tract of land reserved for cultured and distinguished lawyers, businessmen, ministers, and carefully selected politicians, editors, and authors. Although he was a crude Westerner, he was warmly welcomed by the Hartford Circle, Charles Dudley Warner, John Hooker, the Beecher family, and others. Twain soon joined the social circle, and his home became a favorite meeting place. In the tradition of Nook Farm, neighbors and friends were always welcome. They entered without knocking and without formal invitation. They marveled at the grandeur of this addition to their community, much to the satisfaction of the owner, Mark Twain. Entering the mansion through the front door, they stood in awe of the grand front hall, with its carved stair railings and posts, and its stenciled ceiling, designed and painted by Louis Tiffany. But this was only a foretaste of what first-time visitors were to see in a house that represented the height of taste and art in the late 19th century. The house was completed in 1874 at a cost of $70,000, plus $21,000 for furnishings, which Olivia acquired in New York City and Europe, and $31,000 for 5 acres of land, for a grand total of $122,000. It had 19 rooms, 18 fireplaces, and 5 baths. Large windows gave it a cheery atmosphere. Its departure from prevailing gloomy Victorian styles of the neighboring houses caused it to become known as Mark Twain's practical joke. Joke or no joke, it suited Mark Twain, who, in Tom Sawyer fashion, was attempting to throw a lot of style into this project. The house represented for him the pinnacle of fame and fortune after 10 years of publishing and lecturing. Here he could bask in his fame and display openly his newly acquired genteelness and sophistication. Mark Twain welcomed neighbors and friends to his house, but often deplored seeing the many strangers who came to visit. His daughter, Clara, wrote, "There was a large balcony off the billiard room extending right into the tops of the trees. Sometimes Father hid there when he thought he heard someone coming." Another special feature of this house was a glass conservatory where plants, set in the ground, bloomed about a fountain and sent their fragrance into the house. Flowering vines climbed the walls of the indoor garden, and crickets chirped in the soil. True to Twain's style, his conservatory was the most elaborate in the city. The conservatory was attached to the library, an impressive room highlighted by a carved mantelpiece imported from Scotland. The family spent much time in this room playing charades, acting out stories, and listening to Mark read. Best of all, the children liked his impromptu stories. They would require me, he recalled in his autobiography, to construct a romance, always impromptu, and into that romance I had to get all that bric-a-brac and the 3 pictures. I had to start always with the cat and finish with Emmeline. Adjoining the library was the dining room. Mealtimes were interesting occasions at the Twain house. With or without guests present, he habitually paced back and forth between courses of a meal. In a biography of her father, Susie wrote, "Papa has a peculiar gait we like. He always walks up and down the room while thinking, and between each course at meals." In the master bedroom stood the grand Venetian bed. Mark said it was the most comfortable bedstead that ever was, with space enough in it for a family, and carved angels enough surmounting its twisted columns and its headboard and footboard to bring peace to the sleepers and pleasant dreams. The family lived in their Hartford mansion for 17 happy years. Shortly after Mark and Livy moved to Hartford, their first child, a son, died. In 1872, 1874, and 1880, their 3 daughters, Susie, Clara, and Jean, were born. All 3 inherited their father's gift of creativity, literary aptitude, and sympathetic concerns, and their mother's gentleness and beauty. Mark Twain's humanitarian sympathies began to evolve in stories such as The Prince and the Pauper. It was the family's favorite story. Young Susie especially appreciated her father's humanitarianism. "I have wanted Papa to write a book that would reveal something of his kind, sympathetic nature, and The Prince and the Pauper partly does it." Although it may appear difficult to reconcile Mark Twain's extravagance with his sympathetic nature, it is important to remember that he was constantly helping people. In this drawing room, he met and heard many petitioners for aid. He helped students through college, published unsuccessful books by aspiring authors, and became a member of the governing committee of a local relief organization. One of his most noteworthy charitable contributions was his promotion of a fund drive for the education of Helen Keller. Twain hoped to continue these activities and his comfortable life in Nook Farm. From the Texas deck, he could look over his property. In a letter to his mother, he wrote, There is no other place in Hartford quite so lovely. There is nothing flashy about the grounds, but they are singularly shapely and bright, and they fit. The house and barn grew out of them and were part of them. The barn contains stables for the horses, storage area for carriages, and upstairs living quarters for the coachman. Although he was content to ride in his carriage, his overpowering interest in gadgets and machinery compelled him to experiment. He invented and patented several items. At age 49, he learned to ride a bicycle. In Taming the Bicycle, he wrote of tackling an empty back street 30 yards wide. I knew it was not wide enough. Still, I thought that by keeping strict watch and wasting no space unnecessarily, I could crowd through. The piece of machinery which claimed the greatest share of his interest and money was a typesetting machine invented by James W. Page. As a printer, Mark Twain knew the value of an automatic typesetter. He expected to make his fortune by renting out typesetters and collecting royalties. He wrote to his nephew, Charles Webster, 3 years from now I calculate to have about 1,000 of these machines hired out in this country at $2,500,000. The typesetter was a wonderful invention, but it was too delicate and too advanced to be used by anyone but the inventor. Instead of realizing his millions, Twain lost about $300,000. While engaged in this venture, he was offered cheap stock in the new telephone system by Alexander Graham Bell, but Twain thought the telephone a poor risk. Mark Twain was known for his generosity, and he seldom turned down a plea for financial help. Hopeful inventors and writers constantly sought his aid. When his funds ran low, he turned to his surest means of income, lecturing, although he hated it. In a letter to Livy, early in their marriage, he wrote, I do hate lecturing, and I shall try hard to have as little as possible of it to do hereafter. Regarding his generosity, Reverend Joseph H. Twitchell, one of Twain's closest friends and pastor of the Asylum Church, where Twain attended, said that Twain had exquisite sentiments underneath, extreme affectionateness, immediate responsiveness to any appeal to his sense of pity, and an easy susceptibility to tears. Mark Twain's beneficent nature encompassed most specifically the people who lived in close proximity to his home. One of these was Harriet Beecher Stowe, now an elderly widow living in Nook Farm. In his autobiography, Mark Twain observed, Mrs. Harriet Beecher Stowe was a neighbor of ours in Hartford, with no fences between, and in those days she made as much use of our grounds as of her own in pleasant weather. Harriet Beecher Stowe had stirred the nation's conscience in 1852 with the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin. Her concern for the inhumanity of slavery was repeated and reinforced by Twain in The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. The Hartford years were productive and happy for Mark Twain, but the hectic pace of social and business affairs of the city drove him to the rural solitude of Jerusalem Hill, near Elmira, New York, where each summer he could write in undisturbed seclusion in his octagonal cottage. His wife's sister, Susie Crane, had this cottage built for him in a remote corner of Quarry Farm. Mark Twain commented, "It's octagonal, with a peaked roof, each octagon filled with a spacious window. It is a cozy nest with just room in it for a sofa and a table and 3 or 4 chairs. Here he wrote all or portions of many novels, including Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn." Mark Twain wrote to a friend, "I wish you were here to spend the summer. We are perched on a hilltop that overlooks a little world of green valleys, shining rivers, sumptuous forests, and billowy uplands. It is the quietest of all quiet places." According to the noted critic Walter Blair, the quietness of Quarry Farm is reflected in the peaceful mood of Huck's and Jim's raft voyage down the river. But the isolated, peaceful study did not deter Twain from exposing inhumanity and political corruption. In bold, sometimes turbulent, always vigorous prose, he hammered away in the episodes at tyranny, fraudulent schemes, and romantic misconceptions. A few years previous to Huckleberry Finn, Twain had told his own story. In a mild form, yet realistic in content, Tom Sawyer tells the story of boyhood times in the small Mississippi River town of Hannibal. Mark Twain hesitated putting this book on the market, fearing it to be too realistic for a genteel reading public, but William Dean Howells assured him it was a wonderful story and artistically sincere. During the long winters in Hartford, he continued to write and to edit what he wrote. For this task of editing, he had the capable assistance of his chief critics, his wife and 3 daughters. They faithfully crossed out the strong language and coarse passages unfit for children to read or hear. They edited The Gilded Age, A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, The Prince and the Pauper, Tom Sawyer, Huckleberry Finn, and others. His book sold well to a reading public which enjoyed his simple, vigorous, lucid style. His diction and preciseness captured the vernacular of the American people. He was at the pinnacle of his fame, but his support of unsuccessful business ventures, especially the Page typesetter and his own Webster Publishing Company, forced him to declare bankruptcy and to seek less expensive lodgings. With heavy hearts, the family moved to Europe in 1891, never to reside again in their beautiful Hartford home. From 1891 until 1900, Mark Twain lived in Europe, but he made frequent trips to the United States to settle business matters, working especially on ways to repay the $96,000 debt for which he filed bankruptcy. He was not legally responsible for the debt, but he felt morally responsible to repay every cent, a task he accomplished in 1895 by making a round-the-world lecture tour and writing the book Following the Equator. Toward the end of the tour, Mark and Livy received word that Susie was ill. While Livy was on the ship bound for New York, Mark, still in England, read the fateful cablegram. Susie was peacefully released today. It was a severe shock. In deep grief, he said, "It is one of the mysteries of our nature that a man, all unprepared, can receive a thunderstroke like that and live." Her death at 24 was only the beginning of griefs. Already his wife, Livy, was battling a fatal disease. For 2½ years, the family lived in various places in upstate New York. Livy's health continued to fail, so they moved to the warm climate of Italy. But her suffering continued to increase until her death in 1904. After her burial in Elmira, Mark rented this large house on Fifth Avenue in New York City. Here he enjoyed his popularity. He tolerated the constant requests from reporters for his opinions on national and world issues. But in his writings, he bitterly denounced the corrupt, hypocritical human race. In works such as What is Man?, The Man That Corrupted Hadleyburg, and Captain Stormfield's Visit to Heaven, he expressed his pessimistic and bitter attitude toward the selfish, spiteful, fallible human race. In What is Man? He wrote, "The fact that man knows right from wrong proves his intellectual superiority to the other creatures, but the fact that he can do wrong proves his moral inferiority to any creature that cannot." The heavy demands for speaking engagements and the constantly ringing doorbell and telephone in New York City compelled him to seek a place of retirement. In 1908, he had this house built on a hill near Redding, Connecticut. He named it Stormfield. Here his daughter Clara was married. Here also, on Christmas Eve of 1909, his daughter Jean died. Mark Twain's last piece of writing was a brief tribute entitled The Death of Jean. Stormfield turned out to be his last home. Following 4 months of suffering, Mark Twain died at Stormfield on April 21, 1910, at the age of 74. His body was taken to New York's Brick Presbyterian Church, where thousands filed by to view and to honor the most noted and the most widely read of all American writers. He was buried in the Langdon Cemetery plot in Elmira. Here he was laid to rest beside his wife, 2 daughters, and his son. Only one daughter, Clara, married and lived a normal lifespan. Mark Twain had lived a full, ambitious, turbulent life. He accomplished proficiency as a printer, steamboat pilot, journalist, world traveler, lecturer, novelist, essayist, and short story writer. Beneath his external pessimism, there existed a kind and gentle nature. He was an exemplary father and husband. After Olivia's death, he poured out his admiration for her in his autobiography. She was slender and beautiful. Under a grave and gentle exterior burned inextinguishable fires of sympathy, energy, devotion, enthusiasm, and absolutely limitless affection. She was always frail in body, and she lived upon her spirit, whose hopefulness and courage were indestructible. Mark Twain lived through a turbulent time of United States history: the Civil War, the Reconstruction era, the economic crash of the 1890s, and the international unrest preceding the First World War. These events touched his life and helped to shape his destiny and his attitudes. In the midst of pessimism and tragedy, Mark Twain retained his sense of humor. His bitter attacks against oppression and tyranny were clothed in satirical garments adorned with generous amounts of humor. Mark Twain. Few names touch off as much emotional reaction among the readers of American literature. He epitomizes the sensitive, observant, accurate recorder of human life. His daughter Clara concluded her biography, My Father Mark Twain. His had been a life of sorrows, struggles, disappointments, triumphs, joys, and once more sorrows. He had fought his way on the battlefield with the fire of a soldier, but his weapons had been that wit and humor which is born of profound human understanding.